Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 4-game Major League Baseball slate. I know it says 5, but it's actually just 4, as the Chicago White Sox-New York Yankees game does not count. You see that all their players are in red. If you use them and the game plays, then you will not get any credit for anything that they do, so don't use those guys on this particular slate. With that said, before I get started, can you guys smack that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by saying that I really do not like this slate at all. This slate is rough from top to bottom, left to right, north to south. Nothing very appealing here. I don't have any core plays, and the reason I don't is because I wanted to talk about the two guys that I was going to put as core plays, in Patrick Wisdom and Seiya Suzuki. Neither one of these guys are doing very well lately. They have really bad slumps, and so while I think they have some really nice upside, they are risky due to the slumps they're in, but they are in play today. So that's Suzuki and Wisdom for the Cubs. With that said, let's get into the slate here. We're going to start with our pitchers, and I'm going to talk about these guys here. So Strider and Valdez are my P1 options. You could do a lineup where you use both these guys, as there is enough value on the slate, though it is risky value. There's enough value on the slate that you could do both these guys. I definitely think Strider's in play, despite his high price, due to the fact that Alonso's not going to be playing for the Mets today, likely, and Strider has at least 7 strikeouts every single game this year, and so he draws a really good floor, despite a tougher matchup. And Valdez is also in a tough matchup against Toronto. He is similar to Strider, that he's only had a few bad games this season, and he's only had 3 sub-20 fantasy point games. His ceiling is nearly as good as Strider's, and his floor is also, so though if he does not get the strikeouts, that would definitely hurt him a little bit more. As for the P2 options, I have Berrios and Verlander here. Now, Verlander's in a really tough matchup against Atlanta. His ceiling is good, his floor is awful, though, and so that he has been up and down game to game, and if that holds true, then today would be a bad game for him, so that does make him risky. Not only that, but Atlanta's a very good team. As for Berrios, he is facing Houston, which is hitting the ball better lately. This is a game where Houston bats are definitely going to be an advantage from the left, but I do think he has some potential to have a decent game here, as he can score some fantasy points, and he definitely has a decent K rate sometimes, but he's not consistent. I also have a Hail Mary option as Smiley for the Cubs. He's worth a look here, but the matchup isn't ideal. His floor is really bad, his K rate is very wonky, and he has a good ceiling, but he has only had 3 games and 12 starts over 2 earned runs, so that gives him some upside. As for Strider, I was going to mention he does have, only a couple games which were over 4 earned runs, and one of them was against the Mets earlier this season. So he isn't played, though he is risky, but without Alonso, that gives him a nice upside. Moving into our first baseman here, our catchers, I don't know why I'm saying, is Sean Murphy for Atlanta. Now, he is the top play, but he is not ideal. His price is pretty good, though, but he's not ideal because he is facing Verlander, and Verlander has some up and downs throughout the season, so he definitely does draw some good upside for home runs, but he is risky from that perspective. I actually like our value plays here a little bit better, and Yan Gomez for the Cubs, as he draws really good metrics for this matchup. He does feel like a good option, as his metrics are off the charts, especially against a below-average pitcher, and so he draws some nice upside here. Zunino for the Cleveland is also in play, as he's facing basically a pitcher who has barely played this season, or has never started before. He has some really good metrics for this matchup, though he's high risk, high reward, as he's kind of a home run or bust option. You could also consider Francisco Alvarez and Chad Wallach here if either one of those guys starts. The best bets today is to go cheap at this position and take a flyer on one of the 4 cheap home run or best calls. Moving into the first base, we are going to start with Ohtani. Now, he draws high risk, high reward. His metrics aren't that great today compared to most days, much like Murphy, but he does have good metrics, and he does face a pitcher that can get beat up, and so he's expensive and hard to roster, but he's viable on the slate. Another option is Drury for his teammate, who can play first or second base. He's facing a pretty decent matchup here, and he draws a good price, and his metrics are solid. They're not great, but they're solid for this matchup. Josh Bell is a kind of a value Hail Mary play today for Cleveland, as he hasn't hit the ball particularly great this season, but he is hitting the ball pretty decently lately, and that gives him some upside in this matchup. Plus, he's very cheap, though he is a Hail Mary call. You could also consider Matt Olson, Trey Mancini, Justin Turner, Vlad Jr., and Dan Vogelbach here. But they are all pretty risky. Overall, the position is very suspect today. There's not a must-play option at this position. There are a lot of decent plays. This is not a great slate in general. Moving to second base, we're looking at Nico Horner for Chicago Cubs. He draws some interesting matchup metrics here, though he doesn't have home run potential today, but I do expect him to score some fantasy points, though his price is very difficult to roster here. Drury can also play at this position, as he can also play first or second, so that is definitely a guy that's in play here. And then Jimenez for Cleveland. He draws some really nice metrics for this matchup and has good upside. I like his potential here, despite the fact he's not a home run hitter, really. He draws good metrics and can pull some good fantasy point games. You can also consider Jose Altuve here, which might actually be the best play in general. Aside from Altuve, he's the only home run threat. The upside really doesn't exist here. The home run upside doesn't exist here, so we're just looking for guys who can get hits and score fantasy points unless you use Altuve. He's got the best home run risk, but he doesn't have the best matchup by any stretch. So moving into the third base, we were going to talk about Jose Ramirez and Rafael Devers. Both these guys have home run potential here. Both of them have not hit the ball very well lately, and they haven't got great batting averages on the season either. They do have good metrics, though, and Devers has better metrics simply because he has more home run potential, but the batting average is really suspect so far this year, and this game's on the road, which seems to harm him this season. Then we'll look at Rendon for the Angels, who draws really good metrics here. I really like the matchup here. He was very close to being a core play, with the exception of the fact that Patrick Wisdom is also equally good here. Now, Rendon has not hit home runs this season, and so he doesn't have that upside that much, but he is averaging 8.3 fantasy points per game the last 10, and that gives him some utility. Then we'll look at Patrick Wisdom, who was also very close to being a core play today. His batting average is absolutely in the toilet, and while he does have home run potential, he is an extreme boomer bust ball. He's also not that cheap, which definitely, I mean, he is cheap enough, but he's not super cheap and definitely makes it hard to roster him with his really terrible batting lately, and he's been striking out a lot as well. So high risk, high reward there. Moving into other options, Austin Riley and Alex Bregman are also in play here. The value plays aren't bad at third base, but the expensive plays are suspect. One or two of the expensive plays will probably hit a home run, but the risk is super high, and so I definitely think probably paying down for Rendon or Wisdom is probably the better way to go. However, it is super risky in general, just from this particular slate. Moving to shortstop, Dansby Swanson is the top option. Another top option that really just doesn't have the home run metrics here for this particular matchup, but he does have some upside, and though he does feel overpriced for the matchup. Ahmad Rosario for Cleveland is also in play, and I really do like him today for this matchup, despite the fact he's not home run potential. He gets some good metrics here, and he has some tendency to have good fantasy point games occasionally, and this is definitely a situation where I like him if he draws a start. You could also consider Bo Bichette and Zach Neto, but Neto is a very high-risk, high-reward play. This position is just not very deep. There's not much home run upside, and a couple expensive options are available, and a couple of cheap options are available, but there's really not much to love about the position in general, especially from a home run potential. If you just want pure home run, then Bo Bichette is probably your best bet. Moving to outfielders, talk about another position. This is rough. We have Yoshida, Alvarez, Trout, and Tucker, my top four top plays, as in over $5,000 plays. Acuna Jr. is also in play, but I don't even know how you're going to roster him today, as he's so expensive and he's got a tough matchup. He has been hitting the ball really well, but he definitely has a lot of risk involved today. But some value plays here. Suzuki, now I really thought about putting him as a core play, but again, he has just been absolutely abysmal recently, and he's had one game over 10 fantasy points in like 15 or 16 games, so I just really don't love the upside. I don't love the potential here because of that lack of hitting lately, though he does have good potential, and the metrics are really off the charts, but he's high risk, high reward. And that's going to go for Michael Harris as well, who finally hit a huge home run yesterday for the Braves. He's got 3 now in the season. He's finally starting to get some contact the last few week or so, and while he isn't scoring a ton of fantasy points every game, he is starting to have a couple games here and there where he does. This matchup is not appealing, and he is cheap, though, and that gives him some upside. And then Alex Verdugo for Boston. He also draws some interesting metrics here. Another guy that hasn't hit the ball all that well lately, but he does have some home run potential in this particular matchup, and so he definitely draws some interesting upside. However, his price is overpriced. Overall, outfield is not very deep. There's not much value. Hopefully, a few guys who we don't see as starting today draw starts. Maybe in Atlanta or in the Angels camp. But my gosh, this position kind of stinks. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments, questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.